The sound of paper tearing after 40 years is softer than you'd expect, but for Marlon Pike, it felt like a thunderclap echoing through every corner of his quiet, aging house in rural Pennsylvania. His hands trembled, not from age alone, but from the weight of something he had carried longer than most people hold on to anything in life. The envelope was yellowed, edges curled, the ink faded but still legible enough to remind him of the day he should have delivered it. Back then, he had been just another mailman walking his route, a man who believed in routine, rules, and doing things the right way. But one small decision, one moment of hesitation, had turned this ordinary piece of mail into a secret that followed him through marriage, loss, retirement, and decades of silent regret. If you find stories like this fascinating, the kind that unravel slowly and stay with you long after they end, make sure to subscribe, because this one goes deeper than you think. Marlon stared at the name written on the front, a name he hadn't spoken out loud in 40 years, and for a moment, he almost put the letter back into the drawer where it had been hiding all this time. Marlon had always told himself there was a good reason he kept it, even if that reason had grown thinner with every passing year. It was the winter of 1983 when he first held that envelope in his gloved hands, standing on a snow-covered sidewalk outside a small blue house at the end of Maple Ridge Road. The mailbox had been knocked over, half buried in snow, and the house itself looked abandoned, curtains drawn tight, no footprints leading to the door. He remembered knocking once, then twice, the hollow sound echoing back at him with no answer. Protocol said to mark it undeliverable and return it to the office, but something about the letter made him hesitate. It wasn't just the weight of it or the official-looking seal stamped on the corner. It was the return address, handwritten in a way that felt deeply personal, almost urgent. He slipped it into his satchel, telling himself he'd bring it back to the post office at the end of his shift. But when the day ended, the letter was still with him, tucked away like a quiet question he wasn't ready to answer. Days turned into weeks, and by the time Marlon finally returned to that house, a for sale sign had been planted crookedly in the frozen ground. Neighbors said the owner had left suddenly, no forwarding address, no explanation, just gone. Marlon reported the situation, filled out the necessary forms, but he never handed over the letter. At first, it felt like a harmless oversight, something he could correct later, but later never came. Instead, the envelope found its way into a wooden drawer in his bedroom, hidden beneath old photographs and folded documents, where it stayed as the years piled on. He got married, raised a daughter, watched the world change in ways he could never have imagined. But that letter remained exactly where it was, untouched, unopened, quietly waiting. Every now and then, he would take it out, run his fingers over the faded ink, and wonder what kind of message was important enough to be sealed so carefully and yet lost so completely. Now, sitting alone in a house that felt far too big for one man, Marlon realized that time had taken almost everything from him except this one unfinished moment. His wife had passed 3 years earlier. His daughter lived across the country with a life of her own, and the routines that once defined him had faded into long, empty afternoons. The letter, however, remained unchanged, a piece of the past that refused to let go. He thought about all the reasons he had never opened it: duty, guilt, fear of crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. But those reasons felt distant now, like rules from a life he no longer lived. What remained was a simple, pressing question. What if this letter had been meant to change something? Not just for the person who never received it, but for him as well. As his thumb slid under the fragile seal and the paper finally gave way, Marlon understood that whatever was inside would not just reveal the past, it would rewrite everything he thought he knew about it. The paper inside was thicker than he expected, the kind used for formal documents, and it carried a faint scent of something old, yet preserved, like it had been waiting patiently rather than decaying. Marlon carefully unfolded it, his eyes adjusting to the tight, deliberate handwriting that filled nearly every inch of the page. The first line alone made his breath catch, not because it was shocking, but because it was deeply personal in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't addressed to a business or marked as official correspondence. It was written directly to a man named Calder Rook, the same name still printed on the front of the envelope. The tone was urgent, almost pleading, yet controlled, as if the writer had fought hard to remain composed while putting something incredibly important into words. Marlon leaned back slightly in his chair, his heart beginning to beat faster as he realized this wasn't just a forgotten note. It was a message that had once carried weight, intention, and consequence, all of which had been suspended in time because of a decision he had made decades earlier. As he continued reading, fragments of a story began to emerge, and with them a growing sense of unease. The letter spoke of a financial arrangement, something about assets being transferred quietly, away from public records, under circumstances that were never fully explained but clearly serious. There were references to legal names, trusts, and a deadline that had long since passed, yet the implications of it all felt very much alive. Marlon's brow furrowed as he reached a section that mentioned a sealed account, one that could only be accessed with specific documentation enclosed separately. His eyes darted back to the envelope, suddenly aware that it had felt heavier for a reason. He reached inside again and pulled out a second folded insert he hadn't noticed before, smaller but more rigid, like a certificate or an official notice. The weight of what he was holding began to settle in his chest, not as excitement but as something far more complicated. Responsibility mixed with the creeping realization that he had unknowingly been the keeper of something significant for most of his life. The document was dated just weeks before that cold winter day in 1983, and it carried the name of a financial institution Marlon vaguely recognized, though it had likely changed or disappeared over the years. It outlined a trust fund established under the name Calder-Rook, with conditions tied to identity verification and claim within a certain time frame. But what made Marlon's hands go cold was a handwritten note at the bottom, added separately from the printed text. It read like an afterthought, but its message was unmistakable. If the letter was not delivered directly, the finder, or the one in possession, was to come forward with it, as the contents could legally transfer under specific circumstances. Marlon read that line again, slower this time, as if hoping he had misunderstood it. But the words didn't change. They sat there, fixed and undeniable, quietly suggesting that this wasn't just a missed delivery, it was something that had been waiting for whoever ended up holding it. Marlon placed the papers on the table in front of him, his mind struggling to reconcile the simple act of opening an old envelope with the reality now unfolding around him. For years, the letter had represented guilt, a small but persistent reminder of a job not properly done. Now, it felt like something else entirely, something far larger than a mistake. He thought about the man it was meant for, about the empty house and the for sale sign, about how easily lives could disappear without explanation. And then slowly, his thoughts turned inward. If what the document suggested was true, then the passage of time hadn't erased the letter's purpose. It had shifted it. The room felt quieter than before, the ticking clock on the wall suddenly louder, marking each second as if urging him to act. Marlon leaned forward again, staring at the papers, knowing that whatever came next would no longer be about the past alone. It would demand something from him in the present, something he could no longer ignore. Marlon didn't move for a long time after reading the documents, his eyes fixed on the table as if the answers might rearrange themselves if he just waited. The quiet of the house pressed in around him, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. He had spent most of his life believing that time had a way of settling things, of smoothing out mistakes until they no longer mattered. But this felt different. This felt like time had been holding something in place, preserving it until he was finally forced to confront it. His fingers hovered over the paper again, tracing the handwritten note at the bottom, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the words had been meant for him all along, even if that made no logical sense. The idea was unsettling, almost absurd, yet the longer he sat with it, the harder it became to dismiss. It wasn't just the mention of transfer or possession, it was the tone, the way the message seemed to anticipate being lost, as though whoever wrote it had prepared for exactly this kind of outcome. He pushed himself up from the chair and walked slowly toward the hallway, the wooden floor creaking under each step, carrying the documents with him as if putting them down might somehow make them disappear. His mind drifted back to that street on Maple Ridge Road, trying to recall details he hadn't thought about in decades. The house had been small, painted blue, with a narrow porch and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left even before it had been knocked over by the snow. But what stood out now, more clearly than before, was the feeling he had that day, the sense that something wasn't quite right. It hadn't just been an empty house, it had felt abandoned too quickly, as if whoever lived there had left in a hurry, leaving pieces of their life behind. At the time, he had brushed it off as none of his business, just another stop on his route. Now, that memory carried weight, like a detail he had overlooked in a story that was only just beginning to make sense. Back in the living room, Marlon reached for the old landline phone he rarely used anymore, his hand hesitating over the receiver. He didn't even know who he would call or what he would say, but the instinct to reach out, to confirm something, was strong enough that he couldn't ignore it. After a moment, he set the phone back down and instead turned toward a small cabinet near the window where he kept a box of old records and paperwork from his years with the Postal Service. It took him a few minutes to find what he was looking for, an aging directory filled with names, routes, and notes scribbled in the margins. He flipped through the pages carefully, stopping when he reached the section that listed Maple Ridge Road. His eyes scanned the faded entries until they landed on it. Calder Rook, listed as the occupant of that blue house. Next to the name was a short note, written in his own handwriting, something he hadn't remembered until now. No response. Property appears vacant. Marlon stared at that note, a strange mix of recognition and disbelief washing over him as he realized how little he had questioned it at the time. It had been just another line in a long list of deliveries, another routine observation that didn't require follow-up. But now, with the letter open in front of him and the implications settling in, that single sentence felt inadequate, almost careless. He leaned back in his chair, the directory still open on his lap, and considered what it would mean to dig deeper, to follow this thread beyond the boundaries of his quiet, predictable life. The documents on the table weren't just suggesting a financial opportunity. They were pointing toward a story that had been interrupted, one that might still have pieces waiting to be uncovered. As the afternoon light shifted through the window, casting long shadows across the room, Marlon understood that keeping the letter hidden had been a passive choice, one that required nothing from him. But moving forward, asking questions, seeking answers, that would demand effort, courage, and a willingness to face whatever truth had been buried along with that undelivered message. Marlon spent the rest of the afternoon turning his quiet living room into something that felt closer to an investigation than a place of rest, spreading out the letter, the trust document, and the old postal directory across the table like pieces of a puzzle he had unknowingly been carrying for decades. The more he looked at them, the more a single thought began to take shape in his mind. If this was real, if the trust had existed and still existed in some form, then there had to be a record of it somewhere beyond this fragile paper. Institutions didn't just disappear without leaving traces, even if names changed and buildings closed. That realization pushed him towards something he hadn't done in years with any real urgency. He turned on his old computer. The machine hummed to life slowly, as if protesting the sudden demand for relevance, and Marlon sat down, adjusting his glasses, feeling an unfamiliar mix of hesitation and determination. He wasn't a man who relied on technology, but he understood enough to know that answers, or at least directions, could be found if he was willing to look. It took time, far more time than it would have for someone younger or more practiced, but eventually, fragments began to appear on the screen. The name of the financial institution listed on the document had indeed existed, though it had been absorbed into a larger bank sometime in the early 2000s. Marlon followed the trail carefully, clicking through archived pages, reading bits of corporate history that meant little to him until they connected to the name printed on his paper. What mattered wasn't the company itself, but the fact that it had a successor, a place where records might still be stored, even if buried under layers of bureaucracy. He scribbled down the name and a contact number on a piece of scrap paper, his handwriting slower and less steady than it used to be. As he sat back staring at the information, a new kind of tension settled in. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. This was a step toward confirming whether the letter he had opened carried real-world consequences, something that could move beyond his living room and into a system that would either validate or dismiss everything he had just discovered. Even with that information in front of him, Marlon didn't pick up the phone right away. Instead, his thoughts drifted back to Calder Rook, the man who was supposed to receive that letter, the one whose name had been quietly waiting on an envelope for 40 years. Marlon realized he knew almost nothing about him beyond an address and a moment in time, and that gap suddenly felt important. If he was going to move forward, to involve banks and records and whatever came next, he needed to understand who Calder had been and what might have happened to him. That decision led him to something even more unfamiliar than the computer, a need to leave the house, to return, in some way, to the place where all of this had started. Maple Ridge Road wasn't far, just a short drive away, but in Marlon's mind it felt like a journey back through time, toward a version of himself who had made a quiet, seemingly insignificant choice that was now echoing louder than ever. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, fading light through the windows, Marlon folded the documents carefully and placed them back into the envelope, though now it no longer felt like something meant to be hidden. It felt active, alive, as if opening it had set something in motion that wouldn't stop on its own. He stood near the door for a moment, keys in hand, looking back at the room that had held his secret for so long. There was a strange sense of finality in that glance, like he was stepping out of one chapter of his life and into another without fully understanding what awaited him. When he finally opened the door and stepped outside, the air felt cooler, sharper, grounding him in the present. As he walked toward his car, the envelope tucked securely under his arm, Marlon understood that this was no longer just about a letter or a missed delivery. It was about following a thread that had been left unfinished for 4 decades, and whatever waited at the end of it was something he was now ready, or perhaps simply unable, to avoid. The drive to Maple Ridge Road felt shorter than Marlon remembered, yet every turn carried a strange weight, as if the road itself had been waiting for him to return. The landscape had changed in subtle ways. New houses stood where empty lots once stretched, trees had grown taller, and the quiet rural stretch felt more settled, less forgotten. But when he finally slowed near the end of the road, something inside him tightened. The blue house was still there. It wasn't exactly the same. Fresh paint, a repaired porch, a straightened mailbox, but the shape, the structure, the presence of it was unmistakable. For a moment, Marlon just sat in his car, engine idling, staring at a place he hadn't seen in 40 years but had never truly left behind. The envelope on the seat beside him seemed heavier now, as if it carried not just paper, but the years that had passed between then and now. He took a slow breath, reached for it, and stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching softly under his shoes as he walked toward the house. As he approached the front door, he noticed signs of life that had once been absent. Wind chimes hanging from the porch, a pair of worn boots near the entrance, a light flickering faintly behind the curtains. He hesitated before knocking, suddenly aware that whatever waited on the other side might complicate everything he thought he understood. Still, he raised his hand and knocked firmly, the sound echoing through the quiet evening air. It took a few seconds, but then he heard movement inside, footsteps, slow but steady, making their way toward the door. When it finally opened, Marlon found himself face to face with a man who looked to be in his late 50s, his expression cautious but not unfriendly. There was something familiar in his features, though Marlon couldn't immediately place it. The man glanced at the envelope in Marlon's hand, then back at his face, as if trying to make sense of the unexpected visitor standing on his porch at dusk. Marlon introduced himself simply, explaining that he had once been the mailman for this route many years ago, and that he had come because of something connected to the house's former occupant. The man listened carefully, his posture shifting slightly as the mention of the past seemed to catch his attention. He stepped aside just enough to gesture Marlon in, the invitation quiet but deliberate. Inside, the house felt both new and old at the same time, modern furniture arranged within walls that clearly held decades of history. They sat across from each other in the living room, and Marlon placed the envelope on the table between them, his fingers lingering on it for a moment before letting go. The man leaned forward, studying it, his brow furrowing as he read the name written across the front. When he looked up again, there was a different expression in his eyes now, something sharper, more focused, as if a piece of his own past had just been placed directly in front of him. "I know that name," the man said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Marlon sit a little straighter. He explained that Calder Rook had been the original owner of the house, a man who had lived there alone and had disappeared long before the current owner ever moved in. According to what little he had been told, Calder had no close family, no clear history, just a quiet presence in the neighborhood that ended as suddenly as it had begun. Marlon listened, the pieces aligning in ways that felt both satisfying and unsettling, as if each answer only opened the door to more questions. The envelope sat between them, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten, but not yet fully understood. And as the room settled into a tense, thoughtful silence, Marlon realized that this meeting was not an ending, but the beginning of something far more complicated than simply delivering a letter that had been lost to time. The man introduced himself as Darian Holt, and the way he kept glancing at the envelope made it clear that the name Calder Rook wasn't just a distant piece of trivia to him. Marlon could sense it in the way Darian leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the faded handwriting like it might shift if he looked away. There was a pause before he spoke again, the kind that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. He explained that when he had bought the house years ago, there had been almost no information about the previous owner beyond a brief note in the property records. But over time, bits and pieces had surfaced through neighbors and old paperwork left behind in the attic. Calder, it seemed, had been a private man to an unusual degree, someone who kept to himself but had money, more than anyone could quite explain. That detail made something in Marlon's chest tighten, because it connected too cleanly with the contents of the letter now sitting between them. Marlon slowly opened the envelope again, this time with a different kind of awareness, and slid the documents across the table toward Darian. He watched as Darian unfolded the pages, his expression shifting from curiosity to concentration, and then to something deeper, something that looked almost like disbelief held in check. The room grew quieter with each passing second, the outside world fading into the background as both men focused on the same realization taking shape. Darian read the handwritten note twice, his lips pressing into a thin line as he reached the end, and when he finally looked up, there was no mistaking the gravity in his eyes. He didn't speak immediately, as if saying anything too quickly might break the fragile clarity of what they had just uncovered. Instead, He placed the papers back on the table with a careful, deliberate motion, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to Marlon, as though he needed a moment to ground himself in the present. What Darian said next shifted the entire direction of the conversation in a way Marlon hadn't expected. He revealed that a few years after moving in, he had discovered a locked metal box hidden behind a loose panel in one of the bedroom closets. At the time, he had assumed it was just an old storage container left behind. But when he managed to open it, he found documents, old financial records, identification papers, and a handful of notes, all tied to Calder Rook. Most of it had been confusing, filled with references to accounts and transfers that didn't fully make sense, so Darian had eventually stored the box away, unsure of what to do with it. But now, sitting across from Marlon with the letter and trust document laid out in front of them, those forgotten papers suddenly felt connected, like pieces of a larger story that had been scattered across time and space, waiting for someone to bring them together. Marlon felt a slow, steady shift inside him as he listened, the kind that comes when something abstract begins to take on real shape. This was no longer just about a letter he had failed to deliver or even a potential financial opportunity. It was about uncovering the truth behind a man who had vanished and a fortune that had never found its intended owner. The idea that parts of that story had been sitting inside this very house all along made the situation feel almost unreal, as if fate had been quietly arranging things in the background for years. Darian stood up and gestured toward the hallway, his movements purposeful now, the hesitation from earlier replaced with a clear sense of direction. As Marlon followed him, leaving the living room behind, he realized that whatever they were about to uncover next would not just answer questions, it would likely raise new ones, deeper ones, about Calder Rook, the letter, and the strange path that had led both of them to this moment. The hallway felt narrower than it should have, as if the walls themselves were closing in around the weight of what they were about to uncover. And Marlon followed closely behind Darian, each step echoing softly against the wooden floor. There was something about the way Darian moved now, more certain, more urgent, that made it clear this was no longer just curiosity driving him. When they reached the bedroom, Darian paused briefly near the closet, glancing back at Marlon as if to confirm that he was ready for whatever came next. Without saying anything, he stepped inside and knelt down, pushing aside a few boxes until he reached the back wall. Marlon watched as Darian pressed against a section of paneling that looked no different from the rest, yet with a slight shift, it gave way, revealing a narrow opening. From inside, Darian carefully pulled out a small metal box, worn and slightly rusted at the edges, but still intact. The moment it was placed on the bed, the air in the room seemed to change, charged with a quiet intensity that neither man could ignore. Darian opened the box slowly, as if aware that whatever lay inside carried more than just information. It carried answers that had been waiting far too long. Inside were neatly stacked documents, some yellowed with age, others surprisingly well preserved, all arranged with a level of care that suggested Calder Rook had intended for them to be found, just not necessarily when or by whom. Marlon stepped closer, his eyes scanning the contents as Darian began to lay them out one by one across the bed. There were bank statements, property records, identification papers, and several handwritten notes that appeared to connect the pieces together. What stood out immediately was a recurring pattern. References to accounts held under variations of Calder's name, each tied to different institutions, as if he had deliberately spread his assets across multiple places. It wasn't random, it was methodical, almost strategic, and it made Marlon realize that this was a man who had been preparing for something, or perhaps protecting something, long before he disappeared. As they worked through the documents, one particular folder caught Darian's attention, its edges slightly darker, as though it had been handled more frequently than the others. Inside, they found a series of letters, copies, not originals, written in the same careful handwriting as the one Marlon had opened earlier. These letters seemed to form a timeline, each one referencing decisions, transfers, and growing concern about timing and delivery. Marlon felt a chill run through him as he read fragments that hinted at urgency, even fear, though never explicitly stated. Calder had clearly been trying to ensure that something reached its intended destination, something important enough to document repeatedly, yet cautiously enough to avoid drawing attention. And then there was a final note, shorter than the others, but far more direct, stating that if the primary plan failed, everything should pass to whoever ultimately held the complete set of documents, whoever could piece together the truth. Marlon exchanged a glance with Darian, both of them understanding, without needing to say it, that they were now standing in the middle of that exact situation. He straightened up slowly, his mind struggling to keep pace with the implications of what they had just uncovered, while Darian remained seated on the edge of the bed, staring at the documents as if trying to see beyond them into the life Calder had lived. The room felt heavier now. Not just with information, but with responsibility. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but settles in quietly and refuses to be ignored. Marlon thought about the years he had kept the letter hidden, about how easily this entire story could have remained buried if he had never opened it. But now, with the box emptied and its contents laid bare, there was no going back to that version of events. Whatever Calder had intended, whatever fortune had been set in motion decades ago, it had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting, divided across time and circumstance, until someone was willing to follow the trail all the way through. Marlon stood near the edge of the bed, his eyes moving slowly across the spread of documents as if trying to absorb not just the information, but the intention behind it. What had once felt like a strange coincidence was now taking on the shape of something far more deliberate, almost as if Calder Rook had anticipated that his plan might fail in the conventional sense and had built in a second path, one that depended not on a single delivery, but on persistence over time. The letter Marlon had kept, the box Darian had found, the scattered records tied to different institutions, they weren't isolated pieces. They were connected by design, forming a system that required more than one person, more than one moment, to fully come together. That realization shifted something in Marlon's thinking, making him understand that this wasn't just about what he had done or failed to do in the past. It was about what needed to happen now, in the present, to complete something that had been left unfinished for decades. Darian, still seated, picked up one of the handwritten notes and read it again more carefully, his expression tightening as he focused on a particular line that hadn't seemed as important before. He pointed it out to Marlon, drawing attention to a reference that mentioned a final verification location, a place where all claims were to be confirmed once the required documents were assembled. It wasn't a full address, but it included enough detail to identify a specific branch office, one that, according to the earlier research Marlon had done, was still operational under the modern version of the original financial institution. That detail changed everything. It meant there was a clear next step, something concrete rather than theoretical. Marlon felt a mix of relief and pressure at the same time, because having a direction also meant there was no longer an excuse to hesitate. The path forward had been laid out, even if it had taken 40 years to fully reveal itself. They gathered the documents carefully, treating them with a kind of respect that went beyond their physical value, and returned to the living room where the fading light now cast long shadows across the floor. Marlon placed the letter back into its envelope, but this time it felt less like something fragile and more like a key, something that unlocked a chain of events that had already begun. Darian wrote down the details of the location mentioned in the notes, double-checking the spelling and cross-referencing it with what Marlon had found earlier. There was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken agreement that this was no longer a matter of curiosity or chance. They were involved, whether they had intended to be or not, and the only way forward was to see it through. Marlon found himself thinking about how easily he could have chosen differently at any point. He could have ignored the letter, left it sealed, continued living his quiet, predictable life. But that option was gone now, replaced by something far more complex and, in a strange way, far more meaningful. As the evening deepened and the first hints of night settled outside, Marlon stood near the door once again, the envelope in his hand and a sense of purpose settling in where uncertainty had been before. Darian walked him out, both of them quieter now, not out of hesitation, but because there was nothing left to debate. The next step was clear. They needed to go to that verification location, present everything they had, and find out whether the fortune Calder Rook had set aside still existed in any tangible form. Marlon paused before getting into his car, looking back at the house, at the man who had unknowingly held part of this story, just as he had held another. It struck him then that this had never been about one person alone. It had always required multiple pieces to come together. As he drove away, the road ahead seemed different from the one he had taken earlier that day, not because it had changed, but because he had. And whatever awaited them at the end of this path, it was no longer something hidden in the past. It was something waiting to be claimed in the present. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity that Marlon hadn't felt in years, the kind that comes when uncertainty gives way to direction. He woke earlier than usual, the events of the previous night settling into his mind not as confusion, but as a sequence of steps that needed to be followed. The envelope rested on his kitchen table where he had left it, no longer hidden away but placed in plain sight, as if acknowledging its new role in his life. As he prepared for the day, there was a steady rhythm to his movements, a sense of purpose that had been absent for a long time. When he stepped outside, the air felt sharper, more defined, and as he got into his car, he realized this wasn't just another errand or routine outing. It was the continuation of something that had been waiting for him long before he understood it. Darian was already on his way to meet him,
and together they would follow the final thread Calder Rook had left behind. The drive to the verification location took them into a part of the city Marlon rarely visited, where modern buildings stood tall and reflective, carrying the quiet authority of institutions that had outlived countless individual stories. The bank, now operating under a different name than the one listed on the document, still held the same sense of permanence, its structure suggesting continuity despite the changes in branding and ownership. Inside, the atmosphere was calm but structured, with a level of professionalism that made both men instinctively more careful in how they carried themselves. They approached the front desk and explained, in measured terms, that they had documents related to an old trust and needed guidance on how to proceed. There was no immediate reaction of disbelief or dismissal, which in itself felt significant. Instead, they were directed to a private office where a representative would review the materials more thoroughly. Sitting across from the bank official, Marlon felt a quiet tension build as the documents were examined one by one, each page turned with deliberate attention. The representative's expression remained neutral at first, but as he reached the handwritten notes and the specific references to verification conditions, something shifted, subtle but noticeable. He asked a few clarifying questions, not about whether the documents were real, but about how they had come into Marlon's possession. Marlon answered honestly, explaining the undelivered letter, the years it had remained unopened, and how it had ultimately led them here. The room remained still as the representative listened, occasionally glancing back at the papers, as if aligning the story with what he was seeing in front of him. There was no immediate conclusion, no sudden revelation, just a careful process unfolding, one that carried the weight of both procedure and something more difficult to define. After what felt like far longer than it actually was, the representative set the documents down and folded his hands, his posture straightening slightly as he looked directly at Marlon and Darian. He explained that the trust described in the documents did indeed exist, though it had remained unclaimed for decades, held under strict conditions that matched what they had brought forward. The mention of a transfer clause tied to possession and verification had raised flags within the system, but not as an error. Instead, it appeared to align with a contingency built into the original agreement. However, he made it clear that confirming their eligibility would require one final step, something that couldn't be completed in that office alone. There were additional records, secured and archived, that needed to be accessed and matched against what they had presented. As Marlon listened, he felt that familiar mix of anticipation and restraint, understanding that they were closer than ever to the truth, yet still just one step away from knowing whether the fortune Calder Rook had left behind would finally, after all these years, find its rightful destination.
The final step didn't feel dramatic when it began, but Marlon could sense its importance in the quiet precision of everything that followed. He and Darian were guided into a more secure section of the building, a place where the atmosphere shifted subtly from public service to controlled access, where every movement seemed intentional and recorded. A different representative joined them, carrying a thin file retrieved from archival storage, its condition far better preserved than Marlon had expected for something untouched for so long. As it was placed on the table and opened, Marlon leaned forward slightly, aware that whatever lay inside would not just confirm details, it would close a loop that had been open for 40 years. The documents within matched the ones they had brought, not just in content, but in tone and structure, forming a complete record of Calder Rook's intentions. There was no sense of improvisation or ambiguity anymore. Everything aligned with a clarity that felt both relieving and overwhelming at the same time. The representative explained that Calder had established the trust with an unusual level of foresight, including a contingency clause designed specifically for the possibility that direct delivery might fail. It wasn't a common arrangement, but it was legally sound, and over the years, the institution had maintained the account exactly as instructed, despite it remaining unclaimed. Interest had accumulated steadily, and the value had grown far beyond what it had originally been, turning what might have once been a modest financial safeguard into something far more significant. As Marlon listened, he felt a quiet shift inside him. Not excitement in the usual sense, but a deep, steady awareness that this moment was not just about money. It was about the completion of something that had been left unresolved, a responsibility that had passed through time and circumstance until it finally reached a point where it could be fulfilled. When the final confirmation was completed and the documents were formally recognized, the outcome became clear in a way that required no dramatic announcement. The trust,
along with everything it had grown into, was now eligible to be transferred under the exact conditions Calder had set decades earlier. Marlon and Darian sat there for a moment, absorbing what that meant, not just in terms of value, but in terms of the strange path that had led them both to this place. There was no sense of ownership in the usual way, no sudden shift in identity or behavior, just a quiet understanding that something significant had been placed in their hands. Marlon thought about the letter, about the years it had spent hidden away, and how easily this entire story could have remained incomplete. Instead, it had unfolded slowly, deliberately, until it reached this point of resolution. Later, as Marlon stepped out of the building and into the open air, the world felt both familiar and slightly different, as if something subtle had shifted beneath the surface of his everyday life. Darian stood beside him, equally quiet, both of them aware that what came next would be less about discovery and more about decision, how to honor what they had uncovered, how to carry it forward in a way that made sense. Marlon looked down at the envelope in his hand one last time before folding it carefully and placing it in his coat pocket. No longer as a secret, but as a reminder of the journey it had taken him on. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about the small decisions that shape our lives in ways we can't always see, take a moment to like, share, and let me know your thoughts. And if you want more stories like this, stories that unfold slowly and stay with you, don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the past isn't gone. It's just waiting to be opened.